Okay. All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to The Field Between. I'm Ahmed.
And I'm Yasmin.
I think today we can just kind of jump straight into our topic. Not really going to do a ton of updates. We'll be talking about Palestine and the kind of ongoing situation. And I'll be interspersing a little bit of it with a discussion of On Palestine by Noam Chomsky and Illan Pappe. I think that's how you say his name. And I think you also have something prepared, right?
Yeah, I'm going to start us off with a text by Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg.
Yeah. At least for the section that I've prepared for the episode, my goal overall is not to really editorialize a ton. My goal is to kind of show, now that we're a week and a half out from, what was it, last Saturday or the Saturday before?
I think, yeah.
Just to see what's been going on with a week and a half of media coverage. So I have a collection of media from a very alt-right perspective, and then some media from a very liberal perspective, and going to be showing how that all kind of contributes to kind of the drums of war and the dehumanization of people. So not really going to offer a ton of commentary myself. I don't know if I'll stick to that, but that's kind of the overall goal.
Great.
All right. I wanted to start out with a few updates, just kind of news that's been breaking. Israel struck a hospital earlier today in Gaza.
500 people were killed.
Estimated that 500 people were killed. I don't know if you've seen, but there's an attempt on Israel's behalf to blame it on Hamas.
It's so sloppy that even American media outlets are calling bullshit.
Really?
Yeah.
I haven't seen any pushback, but it is like kind of a shifting story. Yeah.
No, because they said we're targeting this place where there are militants. And then after they
gave them like a day to evacuate or something. They said,
yeah, but people couldn't evacuate the hospital, obviously.
Of course,
people can't evacuate easily from Gaza anyway. And then after they attacked, they were like, oh, actually this was Hamas bombing their own people or whatever.
Yeah,
which makes no sense.
That's the thing that Israel's also been doing, is saying we're giving people chances to evacuate. They drop these leaflets. They have told 2 million people to evacuate to the south. But
then they're also bombing the corridors as people try and escape.
So a lot of people, what I've seen is people saying like, I'm just going to stay home. If I'm going to die, I'm going to die at home.
Right.
There have been a lot of clips of doctors in that hospital who are saying like, we have babies in the ICU and incubators, and like, we're not going to leave them. So, and
then there's also the real fear
really
that even if you were able to evacuate, that this will be a land grab and that there will be more territory annexed, that people won't be allowed back to their homes, which is a very legitimate fear that will probably play out.
Right. And that was a fear even before this, right? Like there are stories of people who said like, I can't go out. I can't go grocery shopping. We can't leave our house unattended.
Someone has to be home.
Someone has to be home. Otherwise, if you leave, because there are these missions that people would do and like go around and peruse neighborhoods, look at homes, see which ones they wanted to move into.
And the Israeli settlements have been moving closer and closer to Gaza. So, yeah.
And then very sad story in Chicago, a 6-year-old boy named Wadia Al-Fayumi was murdered by his family's landlord. He was stabbed 26 times, and the landlord was shouting, "All you Muslims need to die." And subsequent reports have said that the murderer's wife said that he was worried about this like global day of jihad that had been going around in the media, for which there was no substantiation.
Yeah, I'd like to write a piece on this, and so I don't know if I'll elaborate on it at length here, but historically anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are really deeply linked. They are really like two sides of the same coin. And it really breaks my heart to see kind of Muslims and Jews in the United States being pitted against each other.
Yeah.
I think that the greatest threat for like Jews in the United States are white supremacists. I think that's been shown to be the case time and time again. The idea that your Muslim neighbors would just turn on you and that's something that gained media traction is really heartbreaking to me. At the same time as which like I hold in my heart that the fear of anti-Semitism and the very real uptick in anti-Semitism in this country after especially Trump's election is very valid and very real. and that Jews are racialized in many cases differently than white Christians. It's still just like really depressing to make Muslims a scapegoat when, like, again, you are just like statistically so much more likely to die in the United States by a white man with a gun if you're in either of these two communities. And I think for a lot of us that came of age in the 9/11 era, it's just been like very, just speaking for myself, it's been very weird flashbacks to like, oh, are we doing this again? Like, are we doing like a sick man in New York City who was wearing a turban got attacked again, like a fucking re-roll of post 9/11, just like blind, messy racialization of anyone who looks brown or is perceived to be brown being seen as Muslim.
Did you see that? So was the landlord Jewish?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah,
But
I think that they were just like an angry person.
I take your point. Yeah, that.
It's because there's all this rhetoric out there against Muslims.
Yes.
And like, this is the thing. Someone who would kill a child is an awful person. And this kind of extremist language just kind of seeps into people who have too ready access to guns and who don't need an excuse to get radicalized.
He stabbed him.
Sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
But I take your point. There's that latent danger mixed with the rise of anti-Semitic and Islamophobic
And I will
rhetoric.
say, I don't want to do too much both sides here, but like when it comes to anti-Semitism in the United States, I will always say it's a very legitimate issue. It's something that like I do think not everyone is aware how profoundly it affects people's psyche, and so like that's something that I feel like called to educate sometimes like Muslims who didn't grow up with as many Jewish friends as I did. Like I think it's a very legitimate fear, but not from us, honestly. Like I just don't think there's any proof for that.
Yeah, I think the important thing here is that this boy was guilty of like none of that, right? Like right,
yeah,
like,
of course.
This is a 6-year-old child. Had no awareness of any of this, I'm sure, and was killed because of this kind of Islamophobic narrative that there was a concerted day of jihad that was happening that was absolutely not happening.
And the protest that we went to on Saturday, I really appreciated. There was a CARE representative. CARE is kind of like the Muslim version of the ACLU. They do a lot of legal cases on behalf of Muslim Americans. And she began the rally by saying, like, we have a right to protest. We have a right to protest a nation state that we don't agree with their politics. And that is in no way meant to be a threat to our Jewish neighbors here in Pittsburgh. And I really resonated with that and was glad she framed it that way. But also, I'm just kind of like, it's depressing that we have to say stuff like this, but I guess it's necessary to an extent. I don't know.
Yeah, there's more I want to add to that as we kind of go on. I know there was, there were a lot of protests, which is just when an event like this happens.
Yeah.
People want to show solidarity and, express themselves soon after. So in the media, I think it was spun this day of jihad or day of rage, whatever, that was supposedly called on by Hamas. The media kind of tried to lump it under that narrative.
Right. And by the way, I think Hamas did issue for something like that, but we don't fucking work for Hamas as Muslim Americans, But
it doesn't matter.
And it doesn't matter.
We're not sleeper cells of Hamas.
Right, exactly.
Like, are you going to tell me that Jewish people who were part of the protests are also sleeper cells of Hamas? Like, I don't know what the
exactly.
But that's exactly the narrative that has led to the dehumanization of Palestinians and Muslims that then gives a pretense for someone to stab a 6-year-old boy 26 times to death.
And it's the kind of thing that I think a lot of us are just done with, and I'm glad. Like, I think, again, we grew up in the generation of Hillary Clinton being like, Muslim Americans, like, show yourselves, like, show that you're against terror.
You're on the front lines.
You're on the front lines. Like, I'm on the front lines of only what I choose to be. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm an American citizen and I have that right. And I don't need to constantly be like, I'm not a terrorist. I'm not a terrorist. It's boring. It's not interesting. It's not nuanced. And it just kind of leads into these really awful narratives. I also wanted to say as an update, sorry, did you want to go first?
No, you go ahead.
That there were thousands, I think I have to look up the exact number, but at least 1,000 largely Jews who went to protest Jewish Americans at the White House yesterday who are anti-Zionist, which is incredibly brave. I know personally a number of people who are both Jewish and anti-Zionist, which is why it's very important not to conflate Judaism with Zionism, because it flattens the diversity of the Jewish American community. And particularly in many cases, it is a generational shift where there are more and more young Jewish Americans who do not identify with Israel, who do not wish to be identified with Israel, who are like, that is a nation state that does not speak for us. And so that's a really heartening and interesting protest. And I feel that those kind of protests are not getting as much coverage in mainstream media as they should be.
Yeah. What is getting coverage is, these protests, and like a lot of Jewish people have turned out for, solidarity protests with Palestinians. But the thing that is getting coverage is, like what happened in New York with the DSA or the NYU Student Bar Association. There just being statements, I think, and I'll get into this a little bit more, but there was a statement in one of the Student Bar Association, a member of the Student Bar Association at NYU, had said that they refused to denounce something along the lines of like refuse to denounce struggle for liberation on Palestinians, right? So essentially just
Palestinians' right to like defend themselves and to try and carve out their own state.
I don't have the exact wording on me, but it was something to that effect, and that has been taken and spun up as people are celebrating the violence that was committed
of innocent Israeli civilians, right?
And that is what's getting covered. No one there seems to, at best it's incompetence on the media's part, at worst it's malfeasance to overplay one and totally ignore the other.
Absolutely.
All
right, should I start with this, and then I know you've got a lot of really great media clips to lead us through?
Yeah, go for it.
So this is by a figure that I followed for a while. I really like her voice. I followed her on Twitter. Her name is Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg. She's a rabbi. And I will say that this is like very nuanced, which I appreciate. I don't agree with everything here, but I still really respect her as a thinker. And there are a number of points that I thought were worth kind of going through together. So this is on her blog, Life is a Sacred Text, and the name of this entry is A Lot of Things Are True. The refusal to grasp this is a non-trivial amount of the problem. So she begins by saying there's no justification for the mass murder of innocents. And she kind of lists out crimes that have been, arguably war crimes that have been committed on both sides, including the kind of like razing to the ground of a lot of civilian Palestinian homes, including the kind of initial attack by Hamas on Israeli citizens. And then this I kind of really appreciated. She says, Netanyahu is the prime minister of Israel, which is the country. He's not prime minister of the Jewish people. Diaspora Jews may have personal ties to a country that might be halfway around the world for them, but they also may not at all. And she points out that while Netanyahu and his ultra-right government are not the Israeli people, the occupation has been going on since 1967, and ultimately that is a collective choice, right? So I think there's a little bit of nuance there in like, one, we don't assume that every Israeli citizen supports the occupation. At the same time, the occupation has been going on for a long time. And it's fair to kind of call a nation state to task for that, especially a nation state that was founded on like the forcible eviction and killing of another group of people. She says, sometimes people ask, where are the Palestinian MLKs? Where's the Palestinian Gandhi? In other words, like, why are there not people who are doing nonviolence? And she says they're all in Israeli jail, which is an obvious fact, but I think the one that people haven't thought about. When residents of a town like Illan try to protest nonviolently, as they have every Friday for years, the residents of the town are tear gassed, jailed, and put under curfew. Issa Amro, a prominent activist committed to nonviolence and civil disobedience, has been detained and arrested many, many times by Israeli authorities for doing things as legally nothing burger as filming soldiers threatening demonstrators. Same story with Abdul Abu Rahma. To get a sense of the ridiculous, he's been charged with arms possession for collecting empty M16 cartridges and empty sound bomb canisters. So this kind of idea of like, why is there not nonviolent resistance? One, I think is unfair to ask the people who are under occupation from a military state that is essentially funded by the most powerful military in the world, the United States. And two, there are people who've been nonviolently resisting for decades, and they have been just like completely ground down by the Israeli state. Mm-hmm. She points out that the first intifada was primarily nonviolent and led by women, that Netanyahu chose to prop up Hamas, including allowing cash to be funneled from Qatar, evidently part of his plan to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state. Also that Netanyahu and Hamas, have working in different ways to kind of have people take kind of polarized positions. I think that's a place I might disagree with her with, just in terms of like, again, not sanctioning at all the death of innocent civilians, but I don't know what else Palestinians are supposed to do if they're not able to fight back, potentially with some means that are violent, because it's just an asymmetrical war. And then this, I'm not well versed in, but I appreciate that she pointed out. So she says, essentially, basically, that obviously the kind of like conversation around Zionism begins with post-Holocaust, but that even people who kind of point to the idea of the Bible for justification for this idea that Israel is inherently a Jewish state, I'll just kind of quote it because she can say better than I can. Remember that both Jews and Palestinians have existed on that land for thousands of years. It wasn't all Jews before the Bar Kokhba revolt, which is kind of a biblical reference, and not all Jews left after the revolt. And the Jewish idea of returning to that patch of land started because Jews weren't free or safe in Europe. So specifically because, again, of the pogroms, the Inquisition, and the Holocaust. And she sort of ends here saying that Jews weren't safe and free doesn't mean that we have a right to make another people unsafe and free. Trauma turtles all the way down, and sort of continues on that line, sort of saying basically that no one's children should be killed, including Palestinians. Mm-hmm. So again, I mean, a lot of nuance there, but I really appreciated that this is someone who I know has a lot of connections and probably even has done some religious training in Israel. And even then just kind of feels really called to say, like, one, that this is an asymmetrical conflict, and two, that a lot of these kind of ideas of like nonviolent resistance are not playing out for a reason, and that reason is the Israeli state.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
I would also add to the biblical justification, even if someone believes that, we're not all beholden to act upon that. Like, that's ridiculous. That's not the way that like governments are supposed to work internationally.
Yeah. I think you can look at, we have the benefit of history, and I was going to get into this later in the episode, but I'll bring it up now, and at the risk of perhaps repeating myself later when I read excerpts from the book, but there is a pretty dense history that shows the pattern of a colonizer dehumanizing and subjugating a people so much that they lash out with violence.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we see that a lot of people have talked about the Nat Turner rebellion, right? Like, innocent people were killed, I'm sure. The Haitian Revolution, and yes, the Algerian Revolution against the French. Like, people died, and I think what we should have learned from those instances is that colonizing and occupying and subjugating and dehumanizing a people is dangerous business. Like, being a settler, you're putting those settlers in harm's way. By promoting a policy of expansion and settlement over a policy of peace. And I think what she said is right, is since the creation of Hamas, like there is a history of Israel funding Hamas and kind of propping them up a little bit.
Or allowing for funding to go through. Yeah.
Allowing for funding to go through, yeah. Maybe not like directly themselves. There have also been quotes from people in the Israeli government who said that, because one of the things that we're seeing today is this accusation that, Palestinians are getting what they deserve because in 2006, they voted for Hamas. They voted them into government.
I think it was only like 30% of people actually ended up
They won
voting
a
for
plurality.
Hamas,
it was 44% of people.
Okay.
Yeah. But also, that was in 2006. Half the population is children. They weren't alive during that, or if they were very
also people
small.
Are not their governments.
People are not their governments. Yeah. And also, there are quotes from people in the Israeli government at the time who said that they want to, would rather deal with Hamas because it allows them to deal with kind of a more like rigid military occupation. And also Hamas, there was a time when they wanted to accept a two-state solution. This is from On Palestine. They were ready to accept a two-state solution, but Israel has historically used the peace process for cover and stalled it and prevented a two-state solution, and has prevented a lot of solutions that are now not really options or on the table, and stalled them while expanding settlements. So they have chosen, and I think this is in an essay from Illan Pappe, and I'll probably read like more explicitly from it later, but they chose a path of expanding settlements over a path of like peace.
Yeah, and also for context with like Hamas's attack, a very right-wing government which is elected in Israel, which I think is a bit of an irony, to be honest, because Israel is inherently kind of a right-wing fascist government just by virtue of being an occupying force, but a particularly kind of fascist government which had absolutely no interest in any kind of future viable solution for Palestine was elected. And so there's really not that many cards left on the table in terms of like what to do with sorry, do you want to say something? What to do with like the kind of government situation. And I want to add on to that, like in 2006, that election happened, but Israel has not allowed elections since then. So I'm going to start with a little media roundup. I don't know if you remember the woman who testified before, I think it was a UN or something, like she was talking about the babies in incubators, like in the Iraqi soldiers just killing babies in incubators. I don't remember that, but that is startlingly similar.
Ended up being like a totally fake manufactured story under the guise of like antagonizing Saddam in Iraq. But that's kind of been happening again. We see that there were, in the first week or so of media coverage, there were stories that were covered by a bunch of media, even parroted by our own president, of babies being beheaded, which of course would be horrible, but there has been no evidence for it. They haven't been able to get anyone in the IDF or even anyone in the Israeli government to actually show proof or verify that it happened.
And again, this is the kind of journalistic malpractice that has like serious consequences. Like, and it also distracts, I think, from the fact that like there were tons of horrific casualties. That is not something that we're trying to get away from. That's not something that I sanction. Yeah. And so there's no need to like make up horrific, unhuman shit. Like real people did die. Like 1,000 Israeli civilians died, which is awful. Right. This idea of like beheading babies is just like a very strange thing that you would use to describe to someone who was like less than human. Like who else could do something like that? Well,
that's exactly the purpose of it, right? It is supposed to paint Arabs and Muslims as barbaric and less than human.
And we do want to keep on kind of reminding listeners that those terms are not 100% synonymous. There are many Arabs who are Muslim, but there are also many Palestinian Christians who do not support Israel as an occupying force. Right. There are entire cities in Palestine that are Christian majority.
Yeah. Like that is like a huge level of journalistic malpractice, and it's a very irresponsible thing to promote. Because again, it leads to something like the stabbing of a 6-year-old boy. And then Ben Shapiro. So in kind of like the roundup of alt-right freaks that I'm going to start off with is Ben Shapiro shared an image of a supposedly burned and charred like baby corpse, and was like, "Is this what you guys want to see now? Do you believe the horrors that are going on?" Turns out it was an AI generated image, so people were able to like find out that he had gone in and just used
what a
something
creep.
Like, yeah. So it was an AI generated image, could not be verified by anyone. Right.
I will say also, a lot of the kind of conservative evangelicals I listen to, it's kind of alarming how much of their news they get directly from Ben Shapiro, and it's interesting that it's shaping their view of the conflict. I don't even know if they're aware of how many Christians are Palestinian or how many Christians are in Palestine. They kind of have a strange, I mean, honestly, like evangelical Christians are some of the most powerful Zionists in this country because they have a really strange obsession with Israel as kind of like a fulfillment of what will one day be like an end day prophecy. It's kind of strange and creepy and strange that it animates so much of our politics. And a lot of those folks like follow Ben Shapiro and just kind of default to his views on Israel.
Yeah, exactly. I bring this up like in my mind, Ben Shapiro is a hack and an alt-right fucking freak. Like he's a weirdo. But he does have a following.
He does.
He has like a powerful media outlet. And even if you don't listen to Ben Shapiro. Okay, we're starting again. The program's gonna not cooperate with me. But yeah, like I was saying, Ben Shapiro has a huge following, huge media network. And if you don't listen to him directly, there are other media networks that are taking cues from him, and they're able to disseminate information. So the next thing that I have are a couple of clips from an Israeli foreign minister and then from the former prime minister. Just interviews that they were doing on the news that they kind of invoke, this narrative that they are killing children and, being barbaric.
What's the view on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza this morning?
There is no humanitarian crisis because...
There isn't?
There is no. Israel is in charge of the safety of the Israelis. Hamas is in charge of the safety of the Palestinians.
We've been showing pictures this morning that would illustrate that there is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
Are you a mother?
Yes.
What would you think if your children would have been executed in front of your eyes? Would you expect your government to think about those Nazis committing those crimes and to say, wait a second, first of all, we need to protect the enemy, and then to protect my children? Your children come as priority to your prime minister.
So
do you know that?
We have been showing images this morning that illustrate that there is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
So blame Hamas and ask Hamas why they started those atrocities, walking around.
So you acknowledge that there is a humanitarian crisis?
I'm saying there is no. Israel is working.
So what do you think is happening?
What is happening? There is a war in Gaza, a war that Hamas started by committing a horrible massacre on innocent Israelis. The world have seen that. Have seen that. Wait a second.
That are innocent civilians.
Just I want to say and give a little bit of a context. Those people created crimes that are worse than ISIS. When the Americans started this fight of ISIS, together with the coalition forces, over 100,000 civilians got caught in a crossfire. Israel is trying to prevent that. Israel is better than any other army in the world. We are alerting. We are giving them the opportunity to have a shelter. We are doing things that no other Western army did in the past.
I think this is Sky News. I don't know much about Sky News, but so this was a Israeli foreign minister. Mm-hmm. I think a couple things happen here. One, she refuses to say there's a humanitarian crisis. She said, like, no, there's no humanitarian crisis.
And if there is, it's like Hamas's fault.
Right.
Yeah.
Which implies that she doesn't view them as human, or they can't have a crisis because they're deserving of this. But at the same time, justifying that Israel is just like totally defending itself against everyone, against Nazis. She even says they're Nazis, which you'll see in the next clip, or hear in the next clip also. And then also trying to say that like Israel is the best army because it is the most humane,
right?
Because they warn people,
right?
Which, as we discussed earlier, not really factual. And then the other thing is that she talks about ISIS, which is going to be a pattern because there's an effort to say Hamas equals ISIS.
Yeah.
And then if you're on the side of Palestinians, then you're on the side of Hamas, you're on the side of ISIS.
Right.
And it creates the same us versus them narrative that we saw after 9/11.
It's a kind of lifting of the war on terror kind of rhetoric that all of these things are connected.
Yeah.
In the same kind of sloppy way that the war on terror tried to connect like Saddam Hussein and the Taliban, and they were not like meaningfully connected.
Exactly. Yeah. No, it's really wild, but a lot of people believe this, or just kind of hear it, and it all
I think
gets
we
muddled
recommended
around.
this before, but I cannot recommend highly enough the documentary The Mayor, just because it kind of shows again Christian Palestinian life and shows that this is not like just like a Muslim Palestinian liberation. Even for Palestinians, it's not just like a Muslim issue. Yeah.
I wanted to point out here, and maybe I'll drop in the clip, but this is something that I feel like even Israeli citizens are starting to catch on to, and are like not starting. There are a lot of them who have been aware of it for a while, but are getting really...
And again, there are Israeli citizens that don't, or there are Israeli citizens that, for example, do advocate for a one-state solution and don't support like occupation. But yeah, continue.
Are really fed up with the government because there's actually one of the ministers visited a hospital where there were, families and victims of the attack at the music festival. And she just gets shouted out of the hospital because they're like, you failed to protect us. We are tired of like this government. So I think there is a feeling in Israel that the government has, stalled the peace process and like has not done anything. And that is putting Israeli citizens in harm's way as well.
Yeah.
So they
I
blame
think
their own
interestingly
government.
Also a lot of, not all, obviously there are hardliners, but a lot of Israelis are more primed to see through potentially the kind of like ISIS-Hamas comparison than Americans. And I think it's interesting to think about how many Americans are primed to kind of just accept, again, like war of terror rhetoric that we've been steeped in for decades. I haven't seen very many thoughtful kind of think pieces in American media kind of talking about how it's important not to just mass block together these very distinct different groups. But I have seen think pieces in Haaretz talking about how the ISIS-Hamas thing is a dumb rhetorical strategy.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say exactly like what the critical mass is. And
that's true. I think I can at least say on a media level, it's interesting. Yeah.
I've also seen, videos of, young Israeli citizens saying,
absolutely.
We should kill every single Palestinian.
No, absolutely.
I love to shoot Palestinians for fun.
But I'm talking specifically about the ISIS-Hamas connection. I feel like a lot of that is pandering to an American public and to the American government.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that is stuff that is like very deep in the American psyche and lore.
Yeah.
So that was that foreign minister. I'm going to play a clip from Naftali Bennett, an interview he did, and you'll hear a lot of the same themes.
We can speak to the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who's joining us now live. Naftali Bennett, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us today. What are the next steps for the Israeli military in terms of dealing with Hamas?
We set a goal of eradicating Hamas. The first step until now was to fend off and fight all the terrorists that are still in Israel and kill them. Kill as many Hamas terrorists as possible and protect our people. As we speak right now, there are a lot of forces, special forces, fighting those Hamas Nazis in southern towns, but it seems that we're on top of things right.
So I'll pause there. Again, I think what you kind of hit on is that in the American mind, what they're hearing is if you are pro-Palestine, if you're a Palestinian, or you're on the side of Palestinian rights, then you are a supporter of Hamas. And then if you are a supporter of Hamas, then you are a Nazi terrorist sympathizer. And here you have a guy who's saying, we're going to eradicate every single Hamas terrorist. So in your mind, on some level, your understanding is that they should actually kill every single Palestinian. This clip, I don't know if you've seen part of it, but part of it really traveled across the internet over the week. It wasn't this part, so I'm going to skip to it, but have you seen the other part?
I'm not sure. I'll have to hear it.
Yeah. Okay. I have to find it in here. I was just skipping around, but he was showing a picture of a family that was wiped off the face of the earth as kind of like, again, obviously terrible, like a really bad thing to have happened. 47 such cases have happened in Palestine. Families that no longer exist, like no one in their lineage.
I mean, I will say, I understand he's speaking from like a nation state perspective. I don't think that's like a factually incorrect statement to be like there were entire families that were killed in Israel.
I'm not saying it's factually incorrect, but again, you are downplaying the humanity of one side.
Absolutely, yeah.
And only honoring the humanity of another side.
IDF does not target civilians ever. We're not like our Nazi enemy. We will never target civilians deliberately. What we do is when there's a building or any Hamas related infrastructure, we tell the people, get out of there. and we're going to destroy it. We hunt down the Hamas. If Hamas decides to murder its own people by using them as human shields, then Hamas will be responsible for murdering those Palestinians.
And what about those Palestinians in hospital who are on life support, and babies and incubators whose life support and incubator will have to be turned off because the Israelis have cut the power to Gaza?
Are you seriously keep on asking me about Palestinian civilians? What's wrong with you? Have you not seen what happened? We're fighting Nazis. We don't target them. Now, the world can come and bring them anything they want. If you want to bring them electricity, I'm not going to feed electricity or water to my enemies. If anyone else wants, that's fine. We're not responsible for them.
This is the point.
But you
this
keep
is the
on.
point.
I want to tell you. No, listen. You listen to me right now. I've heard you enough.
No, I understand. We're trying to have a conversation here. Listen, this is my program. This is my show. And I am asking the questions. You're raising your voice, and I've asked you, and we've already stopped, please, and let me finish. All
right, it just kind of devolves from there. Again, this isn't just some rando. This is the former Prime Minister of Israel.
Yeah, no, it's a huge illusion between like Hamas, who they're characterizing as terrorists, and then like every Palestinian civilian that they clearly don't think is worthy of electricity, or it's not their problem if they're not able to access basic human rights.
And they play this game where they're like, well, if the world wants to provide them with these things.
But I mean, meanwhile, like
threatened to bomb Egypt.
Yeah, meanwhile, Egypt is like waiting literally with like trucks ready to go with aid, and they're not able to enter Gaza.
Yeah, like who else is? Yeah, no one can do anything.
Yeah,
they've cut off the electricity. I don't know how anyone can envision it's a two-sided war if one side has the power to cut off all water and electricity and gas. And food to the other side.
Right. And just so people can kind of picture, so Gaza is a really small strip of land. It's not obviously it's not able to kind of control its own resources. It's completely surrounded by the water in Israel. So Israel completely controls all of the air kind of space. It controls the water. Like Palestinians aren't able to even like fish like several miles off of the coast of their own land. And it completely controls who enters and exits through border. There was like an entire wall, but then also through border checks. So even though the situation is also different in West Bank, it's very different. Gaza is very literally an open air prison. That's not an exaggeration. It is, many people kind of consider it to be the largest open air prison in the world. It's very densely populated. And so when Israel cuts off access to water, access to electricity, there is literally nowhere else to get those things because it's completely surrounded by Israel. And it has been for years. Before this conflict, there still was no way, if there was ever kind of any active resistance, there was no recourse for Israel cutting off those things.
Yeah. And I'll interject here with a little bit of, some information from the book on Palestine. That's by design. The West Bank has been easier for Israel to kind of carve up into different segments and control for kind of geographic and demographic reasons. Gaza has not lent itself to easy control or occupation.
It's also worth noting, just in case you haven't seen a map, though we suggest that you Google it, that the West Bank and Gaza are not connected. Israel is in between them.
They're not contiguous, which it didn't used to be that way. But if you look at a series of maps since 1948, you'll see them getting split apart. Okay, so I have the passage here. It's a little bit longer, but I think it's worth reading it in full. Okay, so this is from an essay in 2014 by Illan Pappe in the book on Palestine. Ever since June 1967, Israel has searched for a way to keep the territories it occupied that year without incorporating their indigenous Palestinian population into its rights-bearing citizenry. All the while, it participated in a peace process charade to cover up or buy time for its unilateral colonization policies on the ground. In the last few decades, Israel differentiated between areas it wished to control directly and those it would manage indirectly, with the aim in the long run of downsizing the Palestinian population to a minimum through, among other means, ethnic cleansing, and economic and geographic strangulation. Thus, the West Bank was in effect divided into Jewish and Palestinian zones, a reality most Israelis can live with provided the Palestinian Bantustans. Inhabitants are content with their incarceration.
That's a phrase, I think, from apartheid in South Africa, right? Just for people who aren't familiar. Yeah.
Bantustan's inhabitants are content with their incarceration within these mega prisons. The geopolitical location of the West Bank creates the impression in Israel, at least, that it is possible to achieve this without anticipating a third uprising or too much international condemnation. The Gaza Strip, due to its unique geopolitical location, did not lend itself that easily to such a strategy. Ever since 1994, and even more so when Ariel Sharon came to power as the prime minister in the early 2000s, the strategy there has been to ghettoize Gaza and somehow hope that the people there, 1.8 million as of today, although now it is 2.4, 2.5, would be dropped into internal oblivion. But the ghetto proved to be rebellious and unwilling to live under the conditions of strangulation, isolation, starvation, and economic collapse. There was no way it would be annexed to Egypt either in 1948 or in 2014. In 1948, Israel pushed into the Gaza area before it became a strip. Hundreds of thousands of refugees it expelled from the northern Nakab and southern coast, so Israel hoped would move even farther away from Palestine. So it's not new that, Israel has had a hard time controlling the Gaza Strip. They've known that it could be, volatile when put under such conditions, and they have only increased kind of the furnace that they've put these people into, increase the
and not
temperature.
only have they increased the sort of depravity of conditions in Gaza, but it's really worth repeating that they've increased the number of settlements an incredible amount, that they keep on expanding closer and closer to Gazan territory. And that is not neutral. And again, we don't necessarily want to there's nothing neutral about that. It is an act of military aggression that they're using their own civilians to take out and enact.
And I also want to add, so I'm skipping further in the book to an essay now by Noam Chomsky, because what we get a sense of from that previous passage is that Israel's policy has been to kind of enclose these people and hope that they can either have them leave over time or just dwindle the population somehow, right? This I found, I actually didn't know exactly how severe it was, but it's pretty disgusting. So, with their vaunted technical efficiency, Israeli experts determined exactly how many calories a day Gazans needed for bare survival, while also depriving them of medicines, construction materials, or other means of decent life. Israeli military forces confined them by land, sea, and air to what British Prime Minister David Cameron accurately described as a prison camp. The Israeli withdrawal left Israel in total control of Gaza, hence the occupying power under international law. The official story is that after Israel graciously handed Gaza over to Palestinians in the hope that they would construct a flourishing state, they reveal their true nature by subjecting Israel to unremitting rocket attacks and forcing the captive population to become martyrs, leaving Israel in a bad light for failing to anticipate this scenario. He goes on to say reality is rather different.
Wow, I didn't know the calorie thing. I knew that the imports were really harshly restricted, but I didn't know that there was that's so sick that there was literally a calorie calculus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Knowing that they have to reduce the population
right
in order to see the Zionist project to its end.
Yeah.
And that is just it's an especially just disgusting way of going about it. And I think a lot of people have stopped using the language of open air prison to just concentration camp. I think more accurately describes what Gaza is. So back to kind of the alt-right media freak roundup. We took a little detour there.
Gotcha.
Alan Dershowitz, who maybe we've mentioned before, but anyway, he's a professor at Harvard Law.
Oh, is he?
Yeah, absolute piece of shit. Has long been a shill for Israel. Was a shill for Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Real piece of shit. Anyway, so I got a couple clips that I found of his podcast, which is called Dershow.
Nice.
He is talking about what we mentioned earlier, the NYU students and like these student protests and that have been going on in solidarity with Palestine. I have a couple clips from him, but we'll pause and talk in between. Sorry, the first of the beginning of the clip got a little cut, but he's mentioning the person's name, Raina Workman.
K-M-A-N. You wouldn't know that from reading a statement made by the NYU, New York University Student Bar Association, which essentially praises Hamas for murdering and raping Jewish women and children. The letter is just signed Raina with the name NYU Student Bar Association, but I found out from students at NYU who she is. Her name is Raina Workman. And she supports rape, murder, as long as the victims are Jews. And her name must be broadcast all over because enough of students, bigoted students, hiding behind their organization names.
So that's the end of that clip. Again, the statement is something to the effect of, I will not, condemn Palestinian revolution or something like that. It is not, I love rape and killing women and children,
right,
and all these things that he says that she actively supports.
Right.
Yeah. And sorry, I said she, but I think Raina is non-binary and goes by they.
Okay.
So sorry about that. Next clip from Alan Dershowitz. Actually, did I have anything that I need to put between here? I do want to say actually that, so he is doxing this person. He's doxing Raina. Found their last name, put it all out. At the same time, in the last week, students at his own school at Harvard, who signed on to a Palestinian Solidarity open letter, have also been doxxed. In fact, there was a big, there was just like a truck with a screen attached to it that displayed the names of all of them.
That was kind of just riding around Harvard Square, yeah.
Riding around Harvard Square, which, you have to assume that the intent there is to create an atmosphere of intimidation or threatening the students, by putting their names out there and hoping that someone retaliates against them.
It just, if you pull back, it's bizarre. The fact that our right to critique a nation state is not protected in this country is insane. I mean, the fact that we, Ahmed and I feel very comfortable critiquing many nation states. We had a whole episode that was a spoof of Saudi as a dystopian, tech place that's gone awry. We should have a right, theoretically, to complain about other countries' leadership, and that just should be protected. It just seems bizarre that it's not.
Yeah.
I mean, most things about the U.S. I dislike. The only parts about the U.S. I feel proud of are really acts of resistance historically that keep me proud of being part of some kind of larger idea. There should be no reason why we have to kind of fall in line.
Mm-hmm. I also want to add that even the Hillel organization at Harvard condemned.
You're saying Hillel?
Hillel.
Such an Arab way.
Okay. But even the Hillel organization at Harvard condemned the doxing of the students.
By the way, Hillel at Harvard, at least when I was there for my master's, is really internally split over the issue of Zionism. Yeah. So not quite unlike MSAs, historically, a lot of Hillels have been fairly, not on the issue of Israel, but in the same way I think in which many MSAs have been quite conservative politically in many ways. Not about Israel, but about other issues. My understanding is that historically most Hillels in the United States have been fairly pro-Israel, but that is changing. And when I was there, for Passover, there was a whole kind of like counter Passover that was specifically kind of designed around Palestinian liberation that people had outside of the Hillel. So it's really an active, again, like a reminder not to kind of typecast communities, and a reminder that like all these juxtapositions are being drawn, like about these activists who are pro-Palestine versus Jews, when there are people in the Hillel on Harvard's campus who don't agree with, the way the Israeli state operates.
But you know what?
What?
Dershowitz is a hack.
Okay.
Next clip from him
is made public so that we can judge them, so that employers can decide, do you want to employ Raina Workman? Do you want to employ a woman who supports rape? Would you hire somebody from the Ku Klux Klan? Well, Raina Workman is the Ku Klux Klan. She's the American Nazi Party.
So again, using intimidation and using the job market as a cudgel to intimidate people. Raina Workman actually, since that statement and all the backlash and stuff, had a job offer from a law firm that was since rescinded. And he goes on to compare her to the KKK.
Right.
To kind of silence or compare them to the KKK. Now, could you imagine that at some point in his legal career, Alan Dershowitz saying that he believes that the freedom of speech rights of Klan members should be protected?
Oh no.
What would you say if I told you that he wrote in defense of Klan members?
That's funny.
Maintaining their right to freedom of speech. So, and this wasn't a memory that I had. I just had an inkling that I'm like, I feel like Alan Dershowitz has contradicted himself on this. And sure enough, he did. So there was an ACLU case in which a black attorney was representing the Klan's freedom of right speech.
Whoa, interesting.
Freedom of speech rights. And it was like a huge deal, very controversial case. Alan Dershowitz came out with this statement at that time. David P. Baugh is my kind of lawyer, writes Alan M. Dershowitz in this month's edition of Penthouse. A proud African-American and a board member of the American Civil Liberties Union Virginia affiliate, Baugh has stepped forward to defend a white racist accused of burning a cross. Many people, both white and black, have accused Baugh of siding with the enemy. Burning a cross is, of course, an act, Dershowitz says, but it is an act of symbolic speech. Its intent is to terrorize, just as the use of the N-word is intended to demean and frighten. But, he points out, just as the use of the N-word is protected speech, so too is burning one's own cross on one's own property or in a public space. Indeed, no one would claim that the act of holding up a cross is not symbolic speech protected by our First Amendment. As Dershowitz sees it, Baugh's decision to represent the Klan is a powerful answer to the kind of legal McCarthyism that still prevails throughout the United States.
That's funny. So basically he's okay with doxing only if it's not for his side.
When the public identifies the lawyer with his clients, he attributes this phenomenon to the benighted era in American history when any lawyer who represented a person accused of communist sympathies was himself accused of such sympathies. No one could accuse David Baugh of sympathizing with the Ku Klux Klan. Dershowitz salutes him as a man who believes strongly in free speech. So,
definitely ironic. That's very funny.
Yeah. What is he doing other than legal McCarthyism now, right? Like in the most explicit and just contradictory
and
terms.
Graduate students who are trying to begin their careers.
Students.
Yeah, like law students. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, I just want to end this segment on Alan Dershowitz by saying that he is an absolute hack. I have another clip actually in, let's play it.
Should apply to organizations that support these rapists and murderers and beheaders. And now they're going to start beheading people. They're going to start murdering people. And Raina Workman is going to find the justification. It's necessary. It's necessary to liberate Palestine to do this. They're going to quote Noam Chomsky. They're going to quote Norman Finkelstein. Norman Finkelstein says these rapists are like the brave Jews who fought against the Nazis in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. What an obscene comparison. What an obscene human being. Norman Finkelstein is and has been for years a Holocaust minimizer who brags that his mother was a Holocaust survivor. I really doubt that.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, how fucked up of him to minimize the tragedy of Norman Finkelstein, whose family on both sides was exterminated in the concentration camps.
Yeah. This is a really pernicious narrative also, that Jews who don't support Israel are self-hating. It's really awful.
Yeah.
Obviously we're not Jewish, and so we can't like fully speak to the ramifications of this or like the intra-community dynamics, but it just seems like a really terrible thing to do, to kind of try and deny someone's either faith, or even if they just kind of identify culturally as Jewish, on the basis of them disagreeing with you politically about, again, a fucking nation state.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea that he's just like, oh, they're going to quote Noam Chomsky.
Yeah,
and Norman Finkelstein. So like Norman Finkelstein has been a thorn in Alan Dershowitz's side since he like called him out for plagiarizing in his book.
I remember
very
you telling me
thoroughly,
about this.
like,
yeah.
on a broadcast news segment. And Dershowitz has single-handedly like decimated his career. But Finkelstein is 1,000 times the academic that Dershowitz never will be, and I think it fucking kills him to know that. Maybe I'll drop a cool or based Finkelstein clip in here.
It's going on too long. You know how to express your disapproval. Otherwise, they should be allowed to go on. Go ahead.
Hi. During your speech, you made a lot of references to Jewish people as well as certain people in your audience, not Jewish people in general, but certain people, especially in your audience, to Nazis. Now, that is extremely offensive when certain people are German. And they're also extremely offensive to people who've actually suffered under Nazi rule.
I don't respect that anymore. I really don't. I don't like and I don't respect the crocodile tears to the crocodile tears. No. I'm sorry, folks. Allow me to finish and allow me to finish. Listen, sir. Allow me to finish. Allow me to finish. Sir. I don't like to play before an audience the Holocaust card. But since now I feel compelled to. My late father was in Auschwitz. My late mother, please shut up. My late father was in Auschwitz. My late mother was in Majdanek concentration camp. Every single member of my family on my father's side,
the Jews did not take arms against the
my late father was in Auschwitz concentration camp. My late mother was in Majdanek concentration camp. Every single member of my family on both sides was exterminated. Both of my parents were in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And it's precisely and exactly because of the lessons my parents taught me and my two siblings that I will not be silent when Israel commits its crimes against the Palestinians. And I consider nothing more despicable than to use their suffering and their martyrdom to try to justify the torture, the brutalization, the demolition of homes that Israel daily commits against the Palestinians. So I refuse any longer to be intimidated or browbeaten by the tears. If you had any heart in you, you would be crying for the Palestinians.
But yeah, just fuck this guy. He's an absolute piece of shit. I think also this is part of the playbook that, well, actually, I will. So he said that they will quote Noam Chomsky, I think is probably a good time to actually just quote Noam Chomsky. An important task in this respect is introducing to Western schools, curricula, and textbooks this understanding of colonialism and strengthening the research on it in universities. If this were to succeed, the media would follow suit. The task is not easy, but if this message were conveyed effectively, we could then hope that every decent person in the West, as in the time of colonialism, would not stand on the side of the oppressive ideology and instead would identify with its victims and deem their struggle as anti-colonialist. This particular new discourse is likely to be branded by the Israelis as anti-Semitic, but nowadays any criticism, even a soft one, of Israel is regarded by the state as akin to anti-Semitism. So it seems this potential accusation should not dissuade us from using the terminology of colonization. Anyone who does not subscribe to the Israeli version of the two-state solution is suspected of being an anti-Semite. Official Israel demands an absolute support of its version. So when powerful secretaries of state do not reflect this version, exactly they are condemned as anti-Semites. So anyway, so just kind of predicting that this is part of the playbook is to view any pushback or whatever as anti-Semitic. I think what's changed maybe since the publication of this book is I think a lot more people are pushing back on that and are
which is really heartening
against that. Yeah. Okay. This is Ron DeSantis.
Oh, good.
I'm sure you know all Arabs are Semites, but how can you paint with such a broad brush to say 2.3 million people are anti-Semitic?
Well, first of all, my position is very clear. Those Gaza refugees, Palestinian Arabs, should go to Arab countries. The U.S. should not be absorbing any of those. I think the culture, so they elected Hamas. Let's just be clear about that. Not everyone's a member of Hamas. Most probably aren't, but they did elect Hamas.
In 2006, and then the military occupation happened after that, where they went in and haven't allowed elections since 2007. So in 2006, there was an election.
But there was a lot of celebrating of those attacks in the Gaza Strip by a lot of those folks who were not Hamas. But if you look at their education system, this has been an issue for a long time. They teach kids to hate Jews. The textbooks do not have Israel even on the map.
Because Ron DeSantis is so into education and textbooks.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. There is a passage here. I won't read all of it, but it is an essay by Pappe that talks about his experience growing up in Israel and how powerful the propaganda is, and how coming to realize that, understand the conflict and outside of historical revisionism and develop a sense of justice that includes Palestinians, makes one feel isolated and threatened and intimidated and is kind of akin to apostasy.
Wait, did you have any thoughts about the DeSantis clip first, or?
Oh no, that's what I'm saying. Is he's saying that these people are deserving of this fate,
right?
Because
all 2.1 million
since
of them.
they're children, they're indoctrinated,
right,
and they're taught to hate Jews, and they're monsters, and as if the same, propaganda is not at work in Israel. Again, I'll reference the videos of IDF soldiers saying that they want to shoot every single Palestinian.
And also the terrible clips of people cheering when rockets go off in Gaza. Yeah.
So I think the takeaway from the kind of alt-right freaks here.
Not all of them are even alt-right though, in terms of the news channels that you chose, which is really interesting. I mean, I guess I
think the subjects being interviewed are kind of, I would consider them, right. They're kind of right. I wouldn't say alt-right. Maybe
Ben Shapiro is, but a former prime minister, you and I would consider it, but I think sadly on a global stage, he's not necessarily considered to be alt-right.
I think he was. Naftali Bennett was considered to be by comparison, people are oh, Netanyahu's
that's right.
The moderate true. Sort of Bennett was considered to be a real ghoul. Yeah. But you're right. I don't know the public perception of the foreign minister who I played. She also seems crazy.
Yeah.
And Alan Dershowitz is a weird case because I think he was a Clinton supporter at one point, and then has done this like since the Trump administration, done this about face, and I think it has a lot to do with Trump's kind of policy toward Israel.
Interesting.
He saw, like Israel's been like his thing for decades, and I think he just saw an opening to really make progress toward that under the Trump administration, and we saw that actually did happen. But I think in summary, kind of just the takeaway from that series of clips, the goal is to shift the narrative and to align anyone who attempts to recognize even a sliver of humanity in Palestinian people, align them with Nazis, KKK, baby killers, rapists, etc. This dehumanization, I think, leads to atrocities. It costs lives. It kills people in Palestine. It's used to kill people in Iraq, and it's going to lead to the deaths here, like the hate crimes that have already happened. And I think there's a pretty concerted goal to equate Palestinian support with support for Hamas. At the same time, there is an effort to equate Hamas and ISIS and Nazis, so that by the transitory property, if you support Palestinians, you're a Nazi. But like I said, I think I'm heartened to see pushback against that.
I think the other main point that you drew out really well is that that kind of really terrible idea that if you critique Israel, that you're anti-Semitic.
Yeah. Okay. Shall we move on to liberal freaks? Okay. For this one, it's pretty short. It's just a series of Joe Biden clips. The freakiest liberal there ever was. This is actually a pretty old Joe Biden clip. I'm sure you've seen it, about him talking about why Israel should exist.
It's about time we stop, those of us who support, as most of us do, Israel in this body, for apologizing for our support for Israel. There's no apology to be made. None. It is the
Sounds
best
a lot younger here.
$3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interests in the region.
Interesting.
The United States would have to invent Israel to protect our interests.
It's so weird though, because I feel like Israel is making the region less safe in a lot of ways. I don't know. It's a strange strategy.
I mean, its policies certainly are.
Yeah. I mean, now also there's been kind of like, a lot of the Arab states are incredible sellouts on a governmental level. There's been a lot of treaties with Israel in the last 2 years. A lot of normalizing treaties.
Yeah. But I think actually I wanted to say to that, there is a kind of propaganda line that's thrown around that Israel is the only democracy in the region.
You cannot be a democracy if you literally have 2 million people in prison.
But that's a very powerful line.
Yeah, but it's such a bullshit line. Right? Yeah, I agree with you.
It's a bullshit line.
There's been a lot of kind of two terms that are used, pink washing and queer washing, when talking about Israel, that I think is in a similar vein to this. The idea that Israel is the only queer friendly place in the Middle East, or that somehow it's uniquely better for women. Again, I think the really clear thing there is not all women, not all queer people. And this is something that I've seen a really obnoxious kind of take in...
You can't even get married if you're gay there.
Is that true? Legally, I don't know. Yeah. I've seen a lot of obnoxious takes among Zionists on social media, just kind of saying jokes about queers for Palestine being chickens for KFC, or this idea that these things are mutually exclusive. One, I think that relies on a lot of Orientalist tropes of this idea that Muslims are inherently anti-queer. As we've covered before on this podcast, yes, some Muslims, but no, not all Muslims. And two, I think it's just kind of this interesting taxonomy. If you are living in Gaza and you are living in an open air prison and you are queer, you're not uniquely liberated by being occupied by Israel. Yeah. That's still your reality. So they're really only talking about freedom of life for a small segment of their Jewish Israeli population and not their entire population.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that sort of line of argument does is that it's just designed to appeal to liberals who tend to kind of have a little bit more of a bleeding heart for when they see kind of atrocities. And they're like, oh, well, I can justify this in my framework because these people kill people I care about.
But it reminds me a lot of the Bush era. Again, it feels like such a throwback because there was all this talk about like women's rights in the Middle East and women's rights in Afghanistan, and like the fact that kind of things were bad for like gay people even in those contexts. At the same time, the Bush administration was like pretty anti-gay. Like it's just so strange. Like I think that some people who parrot these things don't even really care that much about queer rights. So it's a fascinating kind of weaponization without really caring about the people that you're talking about.
Yep.
Because you're right, there's the liberal side, but there also, I think, are conservatives who kind of use these talking lines who, again, support very anti-queer policies here in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've been heartened to see a number of Arab activists, including the band leader who I really love, Hamed Sino from Mashulela, who's openly gay, who has faced really awful just kind of like censorship in Jordan and in Egypt. Someone was killed by the Egyptian government who unfurled a pride parade flag at one of his concerts. And this is a person who both criticizes, regimes like the current Egyptian regime and also is pro-Palestinian liberation. Like these things are in no way mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
You can be critical of multiple nation states, you can support Palestinian liberation, and you can absolutely support the rights of queer people all over the world.
Yeah. This is Joe Biden parroting some propaganda more recently.
Have confirmed pictures of terrorists beheading children. I never thought I'd ever anyway, but there are countries in the region that are trying to be of some help.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that his press secretary
had to walk back,
but too little too late, man. Like there's just no reason
the damage is done.
Yeah, and there's no reason to be blindly parroting shit that the IDF is telling you. Like check your sources. Like make sure if you're accusing someone of war crimes that you absolutely have proof. It's such just very hateful language that obviously is going to give people a very strong impression.
Yeah.
I will say, I mean, for what it's worth, I appreciated it was the very least he could have done, but I was glad that he came out with a statement about the Palestinian boy that was killed in Chicago, the Palestinian American boy.
But this is exactly the kind of rhetoric that led
absolutely
to
the kind
him
of rhetoric
being murdered.
that led to it, 100%.
Like that absolutely to me means nothing out of his mouth if he's parroting. This is the president. He gets like the most, thorough press briefings. He has all the information at his fingertips, I'm sure.
And he's just like
he
riffing
still
on
chose
garbage,
to say this bullshit that led to the death of a 6-year-old boy.
I want to say again, though, that I think it does speak to the strength of our moment and for people not to get disheartened. I am surprised how much he is slowly walking back statements. It's not enough, but I do think it's because of the pressure. I think it's also because we have representatives finally like Rashida Tlaib who actually are going to kind of try and like call for a ceasefire. So I think we're in better shape than we were like a decade ago, but there's still a long way to go.
Yeah. I don't know. I think if I had any doubts in my mind about whether or not I was going to vote for Joe Biden, this like definitely put the nail in the coffin for any hope of that.
Yeah.
I know. Yeah. So I'll be Cornell West all the way, baby.
I'll probably be stuck voting for Joe Biden again, but I'll think about it.
Yeah. This is, I mean, just giving cover for an outright genocide. Like I don't know how you can conscionably like support that, but not you, but anyone.
Yeah.
All right, last Joe Biden clip.
Have you seen his latest Twitter remarks? He is trying to kind of somewhat walk it back, but it's again too little, too late, and still could be much better.
It means nothing to me if he's still going to be sending support.
Right, which he is. Yeah.
So
once Congress gets its shit together. It's so funny and ironic to me that like this far right Republican faction I am somewhat allied with in thinking that we should not be giving military aid to countries abroad.
They're not actually anti-war when it comes to...
Some of them have said that they don't want to give money to Ukraine, at least.
To Ukraine.
That they're trying to like, parcel out like Israel versus Ukraine.
Right.
Yeah.
They still want to give all the money to
you're
Israel.
Right, they do, yeah.
They're not actually anti-war.
You're
actually,
right. But the fact that they're like can't get their shit together means that Congress can't pass the money right now, which is pretty funny.
Brianna Joy Gray has actually done a lot of really good coverage on... she had Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has been trying to kind of spin herself as like a I want to tighten the purse strings. We have all these domestic issues we need to take care of. We can't be giving all this money to Ukraine.
Right.
And she's kind of positioning herself or posturing as kind of an anti-war candidate.
Yeah.
She was on Brianna Joy Gray's show.
Really?
Not her podcast, but another show that she does, where Brianna pressed her and was like, "So how do you feel about, decreasing the military budget?" And she definitely did not want to do that.
Yeah.
So,
but I do think that some of I forget who's the guy now that they just nominated for speaker. I'm blanking on his name because there's been so many, but there are like apparently more hawkish Republicans that are worried that he will try and like even minimally decrease war spending. Yeah.
Well, speaking of being hawkish, here's our last Joe Biden clip.
Are the wars in Israel and Ukraine more than the United States can take on at the same time?
We're the United States of America, for God's sake. The most powerful nation in the history, not in the world, in the history of the world. The history of the world. We can take care of both of these and still maintain our overall international defense. We have the capacity to do this, and we have an obligation to. We are the essential nation, to paraphrase the former Secretary of State. And if we don't, who does?
It's trite, but never forget, this is the same government that insists that you do not deserve health care, that is to a standard of living.
We got money
This
for
is
war.
the same government that insists that you do not get student loan relief. This is the same government that insists that you do not deserve high-speed trains.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's insane. Yeah. I really do think we're kind
I'm
of...
offended that someone would ask, does the U.S. have capacity for 2 wars at once?
Right.
He did kind of seem a little bit offended at just the thought that the United States couldn't focus on multiple wars.
We're such a nation that worships war. It's so depressing. And I think it's interesting because I feel like we're living towards somewhat of the end of the zenith of American empire. Not to say that we're going to stop existing as a country, but I do wonder, in 100 years, will the U.S. still be the global kind of unipolar superpower? I seriously doubt it.
Yeah.
At this rate, we're all going to be dead from gun violence.
Yeah.
But yeah, what a way to go out with just contributing to all these wars around the world and not taking care of basic rights of your own citizens.
Okay. Was there anything else you wanted to add?
I've got some kind of general thoughts if you are done with clips.
I'm done with clips. I had another Michelle Goldberg piece under the Liberal Freaks section about, it's in the New York Times, just an opinion piece. The title of it is "The Massacre in Israel and the Need for a Decent Left." And I won't really read from it. You can take a look at it for yourself. But the overall thing is that it lumps in all leftists as being this monolith. And she points to the protests in New York and, this NYU student and all these statements and saying that people shouldn't relish this violence, this is really bad, and we need strong leftists to kind of stand up and again just kind of doing the rights work for it. And I just thought it was kind of a shitty piece and totally unhelpful. But anyway, take a look at it for yourself at some point. We won't waste our time with it now. That's it. What do you got?
I was just going to say, if the day ever comes and we have to just hold on to hope that it will, that there is some kind of resolution to this conflict, I will absolutely defer to Palestinians on what is best for them. Based on what I've read and what I understand so far, and also just kind of revisiting based on a wonderful Instagram post that led me to kind of revisit some actual original works by Edward Said, who's a very famous, the author of Orientalism, very famous Christian Palestinian, or from a Christian family at least, who spoke very bravely for Palestinian liberation. My understanding, again, and I'm open to being corrected about this, open to this not being the case, it's not my place to say, but that the most radical solution so far seems to be a one-state solution. And I think that the thing that is interesting about that is that in order for there to be a one-state solution, in order for the violence to stop, in order for there to be any kind of solution, there would have to be an end to occupation, right? Mm-hmm. Hamas can be decimated tomorrow, and it does not solve the problem of the fact that Gaza is a prison. It doesn't solve the fact that there are Palestinians who are not able to return to their homes abroad, many of them in nearby countries like Jordan. the source of the violence is the occupation.
Yeah.
And if the occupation were to end, I know that there are many Palestinian activists, and I think it's telling that many people assume that all Israeli citizens would have to be expelled. And I'm sure that there are people who advocate that, but there are also many activists who are not seeking to do what has been done to them and who are saying what in fact they would want is no longer to have unbridled aliyah, or the fact that any kind of person who is Jewish can kind of immediately claim citizenship in Israel, but people who are currently in Israel could remain. And that the main thing is that there should be right of return for Palestinians and equal rights for all. Right of return for Palestinians would massively change the demographics of Israel. That's why Israel does not allow for right of return of Palestinians. But that is what is just for people who within their lifetimes and within their parents' and grandparents' lifetimes have been robbed of their homes. And it would no longer be able to be defined as an ethno-Jewish state. And so it really would be an ending of Israel as we know it. But that does not mean that it would be the kind of outright genocidal violence that has been perpetuated by Israel against Palestinians for decades. It doesn't have to mean that.
Right.
So people who kind of advocate a one-state solution are advocating for a very different world than the world we currently live in. And it would be a radical redefinition as to be unrecognizable as to what Israel is currently. And if there is to be a two-state solution, there's a lot of questions because the West Bank and Gaza are physically unseparated. Is Israel going to cede territory to allow them to be connected? I seriously doubt that. Will they then always be able to cut off basic access to electricity and food and water? I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on the issue. But I think important to kind of note that the thing that is just is a thing that is fairly radical, and it is a thing that the Israeli government cannot sustainably support, which shows you that that is a government that has to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's very well put. I myself feel like I don't know. I advocate for whatever solution Palestinians feel is necessary to, or that would respect their inherent humanity.
Yeah.
I don't think I know enough to say like this is what I would propose or whatever.
Same, honestly. Yeah.
There are a lot of people who know a lot more than I do who can talk about that sort of stuff. But I think a lot of what you say makes a lot of sense. And I think the way that we talk about it and the language that we use frames what is possible in terms of solutions. And a lot of people right now are saying there needs to be peace, which that I think undermines a lot of what's going on. We can't use the words peace process because so far for decades, peace process has meant one side stalls and expands settlements while the other becomes more and more desperate. So one last thing from On Palestine here, specifically about the importance of how we talk about, the conflict, the terms we ought to stick to.
Is this Chomsky?
This is either Chomsky or Pappe. It kind of goes back and forth.
Okay.
But anyway, on the importance of the terms and which ones we should stick to and reinforce that actually carry the weight of reality. The depiction of Zionism as colonialism, the analysis of Israel as an apartheid state, and the recognition of how deeply embedded the notion of ethnic cleansing is in Jewish society in Israel is the source of the key entries in our new dictionary, shaping our view of the future: decolonization, regime change, and a one-state solution. So I think that lines up with a lot of what you said, right? And we need to kind of put these words into our vocabulary a lot more. It's not a peace process, it's a process of decolonization. And like you said, it would entail a radically different government, which would mean a regime change. Anything else to add?
No, I really appreciate you for researching all the media stuff. That was honestly a helpful overview for me too.
Yeah, no problem. I think it was good. I just kind of, I guess, I don't have anything planned, but I want to end by saying my heart has been just absolutely broken watching, the nonstop shelling and bombing and just knowing what horrors people are dealing with is just, it like rips at your soul. And, I pray that things will get better. If anyone listening has been directly affected in terms of either being there or having family, or just even not knowing the status of what their family and friends is, my heart goes out to you. It must be like a scary, terrifying thing. I don't know what else to say, but I pray it gets better soon. But all right, bye.